Hi, everyone. This is John Olczyk here, analyst in residence at theCUBE Research, cybersecurity community activist, researcher in general, and welcome to my podcast, The Cybersecurity Bridge. If you are one of the few people who has not seen The Cybersecurity Bridge, each episode is divided into three sections. In the first section, we talk about the present of a particular topic of or area of cybersecurity. In the second section, we talk about the future of that particular area. And in the third, that's the cybersecurity bridge. How do we get from the present to the future? Now, I am just excited as can be to have my guest here, a fellow Bostonian, although he's on the West Coast now, Ted Harrington. And Ted is an author, in fact, a #1 best-selling author, and he leads a team of ethical hackers. And Ted, I know I'm not doing any justice to your background, so can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, well, John, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be chatting here, and I'm excited to chat with fellow Bostonians always. So, yeah, I think the short version of my background is that I get to live every day on the front lines of ethical hacking. So, I run, along with a business partner, a company called ISE, which is basically our model is companies hire us to hack them and then help them build better, more secure systems. And we've hacked all kinds of stuff, and I can definitely tell these stories or some of them as we go through if you'd like. But we've hacked everything from like cars to phones, medical devices, password managers, dating apps, movie productions, all kinds of interesting things. And that led to writing one book that's already published called Hackable, another one that's about to come out called Inner Hacker. I've given a TED Talk that's about the hacker mindset. And yeah, I'm just excited to be here and maybe share some of those stories and help people think differently and think like a hacker.
That's great. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here. But before we get started with our conversation, are you, Ted, ready to play cybersecurity trivia?
Yes.
Okay. And I picked this one might be a little hard, but I think you'll get it. So, and I have to read it. So the question is, the SolarWinds supply chain attack, which we're all familiar with, involved the initial insertion of a backdoor named Sunburst. However, a separate but related malware, which was a web shell designed for persistence, was later found on compromised SolarWinds servers. What was the second piece of malware called? Was it called Sunspot, Teardrop, Supernova, or Golden Sample?
Oh, I have no idea.
Okay.
Let's let's go with Sunspot. Yeah.
Sunspot was a good guess. It was Supernova. You know what? I'm sorry. I went a little crazy with this
Yeah.
question, but there's some details there but I won't go into them.
Yeah.
I will go into our talk. So let's start with a lot of it's always the term ethical hacker comes up a lot, and the term or the phrase of think like the enemy comes up a lot. Tell
Mhm.
us how you define those two terms.
Sure. Well, let's start by defining what a hacker is, because that I think is the heart of the misunderstanding of what this term even means and these questions and everything. So, a hacker is neither good nor bad. A lot of people, especially even like security marketers, talk about hackers as bad, but inherently, a hacker on its own is not bad. That term is neutral. So, what a hacker is a hacker is a creative and curious problem solver, right? They are an independent thinker, they're a tinkerer. And then the distinction from there about a good type of hacker and a bad type of hacker has to do with their motivation. So, uh, the bad types of hackers, attackers, malicious hackers, they're motivated to gain in some way at the expense of someone else. They're willing to victimize. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there is an equal and opposing force, and that is ethical hackers. Ethical hackers use all the same tools and techniques, methods, and approaches as the bad guys do, but do so in order to improve the security of a system rather than to exploit it. And that's the world that I come from, is the world of ethical hacking. And so what's important to note about this is like what's driving the person to do that. And I think at this point, I think people are going to continue to use the term hackers when they refer to the bad guy, when in fact, that's not always true. It would be like any profession, right? Like there are some lawyers who are ethical and there's some lawyers who are unethical. And if it would be like calling, I don't know, maybe people have a bad opinion of lawyers, but I don't think if you refer to a lawyer, you're only referring to the bad kind of lawyers. You're referring to the profession, and some of which are good and some of which are bad. So that's the what is a hacker part. And then the second part to your question, which was this idea of like think like, and you phrased it as think like the attacker, which I think is a wonderful way for us to think about how do we defend, how do we build better, more secure systems. Like how does in the game of soccer, how does a goalkeeper get better at goalkeeping? Well, they of course practice goalkeeping skills, but they also think about, well, how does a striker attack the goal? How does a team of strikers work together? How do they pass the ball? What does their body look like as they're striking the ball that they're going to try to kick into the goal? What are the different ways they might spin a ball based on how their body is positioned? Like this is what elite goalkeepers do, is they think about how does a striker operate? And that's the way that we need to think about in a security context as well, which is like, we can't just think like defenders. We have to think like attackers. And so I'm fond of saying think like a hacker, because that encapsulates both the good and the bad, like use the techniques of hacking. But when I'm describing think like a hacker, if we're talking about in a security context, we want to think like the bad hacker. Like how would someone nefarious exploit this system? And when we're talking about it in a more life sense, a mental paradigm, then I want people to think like the good hacker, which is look at how we can think differently in life, but do so while behaving ethically and morally and within certain boundaries.
Got it. And that's an interesting distinction that you make of, I mean, the term hacker, I think of MIT back in the 60s or so, where it was just hacking code, and
Yeah.
that was a good thing. But you point out the distinction. Now, in your book, Hackable, you say that a lot of companies are doing it wrong. I think that's the way you phrased it when it came to application security. So what are they doing wrong? What are the common mistakes that they're making?
Yeah, actually, this is a great question, and this was the motivator for why I even uh, set out to write that book, because I started noticing this really interesting trend. That trend is probably the wrong word. I noticed a condition, which is that it seems like every company struggles with the same security challenges. I noticed this from talking to customers of ours, from talking to prospective customers of ours, from talking to people I met at conferences after keynotes, whatever. And I thought that was really interesting. I started organizing that, like how do, like irrespective of geographic region, industry sector, company maturity, level of revenue, all irrespective of all these factors, all these companies have the same problems. And then I started thinking about, well, how do you solve those problems? And that was where I felt really compelled and motivated to write this book, because the conventional solutions to those problems, the way people talk about it, is wrong. And so some of these examples are things like how you share information with the company that you hire to perform security testing, whether that's penetration testing or red teaming or vulnerability assessments or vulnerability scanning. Those terms are often conflated and used wrong, but that's what we're talking about here, like that type of security consulting, basically. And a lot of companies like withhold information. They're like, I want to see if someone can, hack, if someone can get in. So I want you to try to get in. And it's like, that doesn't actually do anything. Like that's not very helpful, because you're not testing the tester, or sorry, you're not testing the system, you're testing the tester. Like, can this tester with this amount of time get into this system? If they can, okay. But if they can't, does that mean that you're secure? No, it doesn't. It just means that tester within that amount of time wasn't able to get in. So this idea of like black box testing is a really, really bad idea. It's just a waste of time, doesn't actually give you the confidence that you might need. Another one might be companies are often buying the wrong thing. For example, the term penetration testing has become sort of the catch-all term for security testing. And you see that term appear in a lot of regulatory compliance frameworks, like you must get a pen test a certain amount of time, maybe once a year or whatever. But then what's happening is that company goes out to buy that pen test to satisfy that requirement. And there are a lot of security companies out there willing to satisfy that requirement by selling them something that's not a pen test. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think it's maybe unfair and pretty crappy that that exists, but that's the reality of the situation we're in. And that's the companies that are buying these things. They don't, in often cases, they don't even know that they're buying something different than what they intend to be buying. But nevertheless, that's something that's happening. They're trying to build better, more secure systems, and they're getting like this really lightweight scan that's not really helping them make something that much better.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But I want to, when I do these podcasts, I want to be sensitive to not just dwelling on all the negatives. So
Sure.
in your experience, what are if you had a model customer that's doing things pretty much right, how would you describe them? What are they doing?
Yeah, that customer exists. I love the reframe on this question. That company exists. They are currently more in the minority than the majority, but they exist. That's the important thing. They exist, and they exhibit a series of behaviors and traits that any company can follow. And there are a few things. So I already touched on a couple of the misconceptions, right? So the companies that do things right, they're openly sharing information with their security testers. They're like, here's how the system works. Here's access to engineers. Here's access to source code. We're going to show you a design document. Like, here's how, this piece communicates with that piece. That's really, really effective. A second thing is they're getting the right type of testing based on their goals. And that might be a pen test. It might be something else. The third would be they have understood and are investing appropriately in security. And this is sort of your classic Goldilocks paradox, where there's too little, there's too much, and there's just right. And almost all companies fall in the invest too little part. Imagine like a S curve, right? There's like too little, and then there's like just right, and then there's too much. And most people actually worry they might be investing too much. Almost no one is in the too much category. Like, oh, I spent too much on security. Like, no one falls into that category, but most fall into the not spending enough. And what's wild about that is you got to spend the right and appropriate amount of money in order to get the benefit. It's kind of like I think about it a lot of times in terms of like fitness, right? So if you spend too little, it's almost like maybe don't even spend it at all. Like, spend the right amount of money or don't spend any, because it's like this. Like, imagine you want to get strong and you're like, all right, well, I'm going to do some push-ups. And so you're like, once a month, I'm going to do one push-up. You're really not going to get any stronger doing one push-up once a month. It's almost like, just do something else. Just don't even bother doing that, because you're deluding yourself. And so the companies who are doing it right, they're the ones who are like, all right, well, to get stronger, I've got to 3 days a week, I've got to do strength training of this, like a 3x10 type of situation. Then 2 days a week, I'm going to do yoga. And then 1 day a week, I'm going to do rest. And 1 day a week, I'm going to do contrast therapy. Like, I'm just making that up. But like, the idea is the companies who are doing it right, they're realizing that you have to invest, and they're figuring out what is the way to invest, and then they're investing appropriately, which includes, that's a whole nother decision tree that stems from that, which is how do you get executive buy-in? How do you navigate the politics of a company? How do you actually measure success? And the companies who are doing it right, they have been able to figure all those things out, because the mission is to actually build better, more secure systems, as opposed to the way that the other companies think about it, which is the mission of security is to make security go away. Like, I have to check a box. I'm going to check the box in the cheapest, easiest way I can check that box. And that mindset's never going to lead you to a more secure system.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is the compliance checkbox mentality. And then the other thing I always see is that companies that are following best practices tend to measure what they're doing, and they know where they're weak, they know how to
Yeah.
work on those things, and they know how to measure improvement. So let's move on to the future. And boy, I bet you get this question all the time, and that
Mm.
is, you think of the future, you think of security testing. How much do you think will be automated, and what role will humans have as we automate more and more security testing?
Yeah. So I think about that question in the context of my lifetime, because beyond my lifetime, it's likely that technology could accelerate to a point where aspects of human involvement could be engineered out, maybe. But I think within the context of the next, several decades, what's likely to happen, in my view, is that automation is going to do a couple things. One, it's going to make the attacker's job easier in some contexts. So like certain things which right now are maybe tedious to do manually, there's going to be tools, and tools are already being developed that are going to make this easier. So like a very unattractive part of the security job is data classification. Like, how do you know which asset is which type, and where does that asset live, and who accesses it, all the access controls that go with this data classification models. That's like so tedious to do manually, and building tools that can make that more effective, more accurate, happen faster. That's a great example where automation is going to do awesome things. So automation is going to make the security professional's job easier in a lot of ways, but it's also going to make the security professional's job harder, because the attackers, they exist in a mature ecosystem as well, and their tools are going to become more capable as automation and tools become more effective. Lower skilled attackers can start executing more complex attack sequences because the tools do a lot of the thinking for them. And then the third and maybe final way to answer this question has to do with what role would the human play in the security model moving forward? Are we talking about like, will the human be replaced? And in the coming decades, I don't think so. One of the things that humans do right now really well, that computer systems cannot do as well, though I think this will change eventually, is that humans are able to bring together multiple different components to an attack scenario and combine things creatively that would be incredibly difficult to engineer a system to do this in an automated fashion. So for example, like, and it's a very common technique that we commonly use is called exploit chaining. And so exploit chaining is where you take two or more issues and you combine them in a way that makes the impact exponential. So for example, you might have one weakness that is very low severity, and you might have a second weakness that's very low severity. But when you combine them, all of a sudden it becomes worst case scenario. So an example might be something like, I'm way oversimplifying the details of this project, but there's a project recently that illustrates this. And it was, one weakness was that you could predict a particular piece of information, is the user identifier. But just predicting user identifiers is like, doesn't really matter. So on its own, no big deal. There was another issue we found that on its own, not a big deal, which was you could exploit a particular detail of the system, but there was this significant mitigating factor, which was you could only do that on your own account because you needed the user identifier to capture this weakness. So on its own, not a big problem. But when you combine them, and now you have the ability to predict all user identifiers, and that's the only piece preventing you from taking over every single account in the system, all of a sudden, you have system-wide compromise. And so that's something where today an automated tool could never reconstruct that logic of like, oh, well, here's a never before seen technique that, or that, not that that technique's never before been seen, but like, here's a technique that is not standard, requires combination of multiple things, maybe crossing domains. Like, you do this to make the tech behave a certain way, which in result makes a human think something differently, and they think that it's like safe when it's not safe, that kind of stuff. So these are the kinds of things that I don't think the human is going to be removed from that. I think we're going to see a scenario where there's the human augmented by these incredibly powerful, capable tools. Eventually, someone will figure out how to codify and automate that creative problem-solving aspect. But I think that's probably a pretty far ways off.
Okay. A few years ago, our friends at Gartner talked about breach and attack simulation tools. And so if you think of those tools with a combination of agentic AI, did those start to play a bigger role in security testing, or maybe even in your tool chest?
Yeah, definitely. So attack simulation, first of all, phenomenal name. Like whatever marketing guru came, like phenomenal name. And you can tell it's a phenomenal name because people who buy products and services, they want it. They're like, oh, I want attack simulate. Like, that's literally what I want. I want to simulate the attack. And it's just great. I think similarly, whoever came up with the term penetration testing, phenomenal, because buyers want, that sounds cool. Like, people want these products and services that sound cool. It's as dumb as that is, like, that's marketing 101. But that little tangent aside, these tools are really, really useful because people do need to, they do need to have attack simulation. They need to know, like, well, what happens in a particular scenario. And so that's where these tools are great. And agentic AI has this really cool opportunity to, again, augment the human element. And one of the maybe drawbacks to human-centric security testing is that you really can't do it continuously. Like, to involve humans, you need to, um, it just would be so cost prohibitive to have a human 24 hours a day, 7 days a week running any sort of security testing. So you have to, like, downscope to something that is, realistic cost-wise. So now if you could introduce like agentic AI combined with some of these tools, and you can then augment the human, they can supplement the human, and now you have the human element and you have this automated element, and including with what the promise of agentic AI is, which is that it could really, like, have different creative approaches to an attack scenario, even with the same prompt or same input or same situation presented to it. It might have a different way of attacking the thing. Like, that's really cool and really exciting. So I'm optimistic about those things. I've always felt like, as a security pro, if our job becomes obsolete because things are now secure, like, we have done our job. If all of a sudden it's like, we don't need ethical hackers anymore, we don't need security professionals anymore because security is now so good, I just, call me a pessimist, but I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I don't see it happening either. In fact, the next question, are you doing anything in the healthcare industry before I ask my question?
Yeah, we published a pretty exhaustive piece of research that looked at how attackers could hurt or potentially kill patients in the
Ugh.
healthcare setting, which is a twisted question to ask yourself, but we explored that, and that could be relevant. I don't know what your question will be, but it could be relevant.
Well, so I've been doing a deep dive into healthcare and cybersecurity. There's no industry that may transition based on new types of technologies. So not only AI, but Internet of Medical Things, remote monitoring of patients, telehealth, large data models, all of those things.
Mhm.
But in my experience, I'm sure yours too, healthcare organizations tend to invest much less on cybersecurity, and they've had more breaches than other organizations. So I'm wondering, all of these great technologies for patient care are coming. What are your concerns with either ethical hacking or security testing in that type of environment?
It's a great question. And I have to be, I think, measured in how I answer that, because I have pretty strong feelings that are in opposition to each other. One is that I'm pretty gravely concerned about the way that security is handled in healthcare, and that's not a, I'm not disparaging any healthcare security pros. I think anyone who works in security and healthcare would probably agree with me that, like, the bureaucratic way that things just function in that business, at least in America, it makes it really, really, like, even exponentially more difficult than it is in any other sector to secure things, because it's hard to get budget, it's hard to get consensus. You've got like all these like really powerful regulations that kind of restrict and constrain what you can do. You've got a shared responsibility model that doesn't work, right? Where you've got, like, for example, companies who make medical devices, they defer security some elements of the security of their systems to the hospital systems in which they're deployed. And they're like, you have to provide us a secure environment. And then those hospitals are like, you have to provide us a secure device. And those are both true. Yet, because there's this sort of like others have to do something, it creates this like really difficult scenario to keep that secure. Rather than collaborating, it becomes a little more combative. So on one hand, I have some significant concerns, especially as we're starting to introduce tech in all these meaningful and important new ways. But the way I balance that viewpoint, and I always, whenever we talk about healthcare, always encourage this, is you should go to the doctor anyway. Like, you don't want someone to be like, oh, someone could hack a medical device, someone could steal my patient data, better not go to the hospital. It's like, I could tell you what, like, if you don't take care of your health, you will die sooner, you will live a less healthy life. If you go to the doctor, you might get hacked, and the likelihood that it results in harm or fatality to you is relatively low. There's people like our outfit and others who are advocating for improvements in this area. So you got to go do it. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I heard someone the other day, I think this is an interesting metaphor. Someone who doesn't think a company like Palantir is ethical, their assessment of investing in the stock market was, you shouldn't invest in the stock market because there are companies out there like Palantir that this person didn't believe in. I'm like, that is such the wrong way to think about this. Just don't invest in Palantir. Like, you can have your ethics, just make, like, that's a really bad financial choice that person's making. They choose to not invest in their future because of this like one thing they're looking at. And I think healthcare is similar, where someone might be like, yeah, there's security risk here. Undeniably so. There is security risk, but there's also medical risk. So like, you go get surgery, you could get an infection, like other things could happen. But there's risk to anything in life. There's risk to getting a car. There's risk to stepping outside your house. There's risk to not stepping outside of your house. So we have to realize that we accept these risks. But in terms of like purely a security practitioner's viewpoint, there's the typical security challenges, like how do you get budget? How do you actually secure the thing? How do you know if the thing is any better from a security standpoint? And then it's layered on with all this bureaucratic nonsense that makes the security professional's life so
Very
much
true.
harder in that particular sector.
Yeah. We have to move on now to the cybersecurity bridge, but I've got to ask this one question about the future. Just given what you do and what you know, what scares you?
AI does scare me a little bit in terms of the pace at which it is accelerating, and I'm absolutely not suggesting in that statement we should try to slow AI down at all. I think the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. So like trying to say like, oh, we just should stop innovating, that would be nonsense. We should be thinking about how can we innovate securely. But AI left unchecked does have the potential to like crater economies. I mean, the amount of jobs it's going to take away, which is not a bad thing. Any tech evolution displaces jobs. We just replace it with other jobs. That's been since, you know, the Industrial Revolution. That's been the way the world works. But it does scare me a little bit how good AI is going to be, and there's going to be deep fakes very soon where you're going to like get a FaceTime call or whatever the equivalent is on Google. You're going to get a video call from someone you know, love, and trust. And that person's gonna be like, I really need you to send me this money right now. And you're gonna be like, of course. I'm talking to my mom or my brother or my nephew or whatever. And you're gonna send that money. And then you're gonna realize, oh, that was a deep fake. Because the deep fakes are gonna be so good, it's gonna be hard to tell the difference.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's talk about the cybersecurity bridge, how we get from the present to the future. Are there security or application security skill sets that are lacking right now that really need either more education, more funding, something like that?
Well, I do think that when there's this prevailing, I guess, data point that people trot out all the time, they're like, oh, there's 1 million unfilled security jobs. Maybe that number's changes. I don't know if that's like what today people are saying, but the point is people are talking about there's a lot of unfilled security jobs. And what those jobs are usually looking for that people are referring to in that are ones with a technical capability. So an understanding of computer science, basically, doesn't mean they have to be like CS majors or whatever, but people understand how systems work, engineering mindsets. And I think the big thing is this um, creative way of looking at systems and understanding they're supposed to do X, but can they do Y? Because that mindset that applies to any job, actually, really in any sector. But the more people who think like that, the more we'll be able to accomplish the security mission, irrespective of the job. Like that's not just people who are trying to become hackers. That's people who are, SOC analysts. That's people who become CISOs. That's people who are marketers, like security marketers. We need to have this creative, non-conforming, committed mindset that is how hackers think.
Okay. We're almost out of time, but I have one last question, and then I have a wrap-up question. So
Okay.
my last question, in your book, you talk about a lack of uniformity for security testing. And so what needs to happen to get to a better future there?
Yeah. So what that's talking about is not that all testing should be the same. In fact, I don't believe that all testing should be the same. Different organizations have different goals, but it's about the idea that uniformity and people understanding even what we're talking about. So like when the term penetration testing is used to describe something that's not penetration testing, it would be like, again, if we use like a healthcare metaphor, it'd be like you go to the first doctor and they're like, you need your knee replaced, and they mean the bones in your knee. And you go to get a second opinion, and that doctor's like, you need your knee replaced. But what that doctor actually means is that you need something completely different. You need like elbow surgery or something. I don't know. I'm making this metaphor up, but they're using the same term to mean completely different things. That needs to be solved. And the path to solving that is things like what you and I are doing right now by having these types of conversations. That's why I invest effort in writing books, it's brutally hard to write a book. Like that's why I invest effort into that. That's why I get up on stages and give keynotes and, speak at different conferences and put my body through the toll of like flying all over the place to do those things, because we have to educate. And so anyone who's listening, who's even like moderately thinking about trying to contribute to that educational process, the discussion, like writing a book, giving a talk, writing a paper, publishing research, please do it, because that is how we get from where we are today to a future where people are better understanding what security even is and how to do it right.
And just real quickly as a follow-up, the MITRE attack framework and some of the stuff MITRE does that help in the uniformity process?
Yeah, I think these frameworks are phenomenal, right? So, like giving people a way to organize our thinking. I think another thing that helps is something like the OWASP Top 10, which
Yes.
organizes a list of the most common security vulnerabilities in web apps. And these things help people start to have a common language to talk about things. And the advice there would be find these frameworks that are useful and help you have productive conversations, but don't rely blindly just on like, we only believe in this one framework, we follow it step by step, and we don't think independently or creatively about our system. So it's balancing the two, having these things that help provide uniform language, but thinking about the unique characteristics of a given system.
All right, Ted. So my final question, I could talk to you all day, but we're limited on time. It's a question I ask all my guests. And what's the one piece of advice that you'd give to listeners after this podcast?
The biggest thing is think like a hacker. It's actually how we started. Hackers are, as I've determined from observation, interviewing, writing books, hackers are four things. Hackers are curious, they're non-conforming, they're committed, and they're creative. And the combination of those attributes, what that does is we all have those attributes because children have all of those attributes. As adults, we prioritize those attributes less, but we all have them because as kids, we were curious, right? As kids, we were committed. Like we would not stop until we got the thing that we wanted, right? And by thinking like a hacker, applying those things, what that does, that helps you find these new ways to do anything, whatever you're trying to do. That could be build more secure systems. That could be find a new pathway in life. And it's a superpower. The hacker mindset is those four things. So that would be my advice to anyone listening: is leverage those traits that you already have within you, and it will lead to really beautiful things.
Thank you so much, Ted Harrington. And my advice to follow up on you would be to read Ted's book, Hackable, and the new one coming out, Inner Hacker, correct?
Yep.
So, Ted, thanks so much for being a guest today. And for the audience, look for the next Cybersecurity Bridge podcast in 2 weeks. Take care, Ted.
Thank you.